Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I realized your nationality and that you knew far more about British politics and Brexit, I quickly changed my topic. And this morning, I'm going to talk about a slightly broader topic. I'm going to talk about what are the prospects for financing the Caribbean countries in realizing the Sustainable Development Goals. And I looked at the 5 main sources of external capital. Let me begin by saying that these small, open, developing economies depend considerably on external flows of capital in various forms to drive the growth process. The world economy has not been growing rapidly, and the small developing economies of the Caribbean have had a very difficult time. Indeed, research from the Inter-American Development Bank reveals that these are the economies that have been most adversely affected of all countries in the globe since the global financial crisis. So the external flows are critical to these economies, and these flows come in a number of forms. I identify the following: 1, remittances; 2, loans to government and the private sector; 3, development assistance; and 4, foreign direct investment. Now I wanted to look across a matrix of the 5 main sources of external capital coming into the Caribbean. These are the United States, the UK, Canada, China, and Venezuela. My concern here is that when you look across these countries, the situation is not very propitious for capital flows. Let's look at remittances. Remittances have shown a steady growth. They seem to be immune to economic conditions in the sending countries, because when income goes down, people draw down their savings and they respond more to the needs in the Caribbean countries. So we can assume that remittances from the US and the UK are likely to remain the same, even if economic conditions in those countries deteriorate. Canada is an economy that has grown steadily through the global financial crisis. No worry there about any decline in remittances. China, no remittances yet. Venezuela, no remittances. So that remains fairly stable. But what we're talking about now is increased flows to drive the process, because the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals depends not only on the focus on them, but depends on the overall health of the Caribbean economies. The prospects for loans are not very good. Why? The small developing countries of the Caribbean are among the most highly indebted countries. They are in an unfortunate situation because as middle-income developing countries, they don't benefit from the concessions which less developed or lower income developing countries get. They also have been graduated from the facilities which have the most generous conditionality. So it's a difficult situation. In addition to which, at their present levels of debt, it's going to be very difficult to take on more debt. Indeed, many of the countries have had to restructure their debt. So the question of borrowing is not so much that there isn't capital in the global economy or in these countries, but that the ability to borrow is constrained. The exception, I think, here is China. Why? China's lending is primarily state-driven. It's not encumbered by some of the conditionality, financial, political, and developmental, which comes along with loans from either bilateral developed country agencies or multilateral financial institutions. I believe that there is a prospect of further borrowing from China, mainly to finance the construction of infrastructure, and that's a positive sign in what is an overall negative. In regard to development assistance, Mr. Chairman, I think this is where we have a serious worry. Why? When you look at the United States, the Trump administration has cut back the State Department and development assistance. Indeed, the proposal in the current budget is that there would be a cut of 36% in U.S. foreign development assistance. Obviously, middle-income developing countries are not going to be the focus. The focus is going to be on security, on the poorest countries, and on humanitarian assistance. The flow of U.S. aid to the region has declined steadily over the last 10, 15 years in real terms, and this is again another likely decline. It's not large, but it's going to be a significant cut. In the UK, we have uncertainty because of Brexit. The situation with Brexit is that there is going to be a cost to extricate from the European Union. The cost is twofold. A, the uncertainty is already affecting the UK economy. That's evident in the devaluation of the pound sterling against the euro, about 12%, and against the US dollar, about 16%. But directly in extricating from the European Union, there is a fiscal cost of coming out of the European Union budget. It's unavoidable, and it's going to be among the things that the European Union insists on. And the UK contributes about 12 to 15% of the budget because it's one of the larger economies. So that creates uncertainty about development assistance, both in the EU as to the share of the UK's contribution to their development budget and directly bilaterally. Add to that the complicating fact that there are many voices in the Conservative government arguing that in this current situation there needs to be a reduction in foreign aid and to transfer those resources into services for the British people, in particular in the health system. So I think the prospects are pretty grim, and you're likely to see a reduction. Canada, I think, will remain. There may even be a prospect of upping that development assistance. China, I think, is a good prospect. As long as the Taiwan-China rivalry over diplomatic recognition continues, both Taiwan and China will be willing to put development assistance into the region, and I believe it's a very, very small fraction of the Chinese development assistance budget, so I think the prospects here are encouraging. Venezuela has played a very important part in assisting the Caribbean through PetroCaribe, particularly when prices for oil were very high. They're much lower now, but the turmoil there is likely to create either a reduction in the flows through PetroCaribe or at least some interruption, and therefore that's not something in the short run that should be relied upon. Finally, foreign direct investment. As we heard yesterday from some of the speakers in the plenary, to finance some of the growth and directly finance some of the attainment of sustainable development goals, there is a move to engage the private sector. I think the prospects for foreign direct investment are going to be important in this context. I see no reason why, even with the conditions in the US and the UK, that we should not continue to get investment, particularly in tourism, energy, and what I'd like to call the blue economy. That is the unexploited, significant maritime resources, both in the sea and in the seabed. The same goes for Canada. Venezuela, not a big source of foreign direct investment. However, where I think the region needs to put some attention is foreign direct investment from China. China used to be a net recipient of foreign direct investment. China is now the second largest source of foreign direct investment. And I invite you to make the distinction between development assistance loans for Chinese firms to carry out infrastructure development. That's not investment because they don't own these things. talking about investment. There's already a flow of investment, and it's relatively small. Some of the projects have not worked well, such as in Suriname with the rehabilitation of palm oil and with sugar in Jamaica. However, there continues to be a flow, and I think the prospects are good. And I cite the resuscitation of a major bauxite plant in Jamaica, which had been closed for many years by Chinese private foreign investment. And I believe, therefore, in this context, to summarize, Mr. Chairman, that the traditional sources are either going to be maintained or severely reduced, as in the case of the US and probably in the case of the UK and EU. I believe, therefore, that in trying to drive the investment process, the growth process, which is the context in which the Sustainable Development Goals can be attained, that we have to give more attention to foreign direct investment. And I am earmarking China as a growth sector in this regard and something we need to pay more attention to. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Hello, I am Elaine Campbell. I am here at the Faculty of Law doing my MPhil PhD research. China is right now busy with its, I hope I say this correctly, its One Belt, One Way project. Do you think with such a focus they will be interested in Caribbean investments?
Professor Smith, I didn't talk too much about the EU because it's not a major source of investment or remittances, although it could be. But what is not clear is what is going to happen to the development assistance budget of the EU. Depends on whether the conditions and terms on which the British withdraw and how soon, etc. You may find a cutback in the EDF funds which have been committed under the EPA agreement, or it may be absorbed without any significant difference. We're not a huge item on the budget, so I expect that there will be continuation. Plus, these are linked to a signed agreement, economic partnership agreement. I don't think the European Union would like to be seen as resiling from written commitments which they have made over a certain period. However, I want to signal that the EU is now going through, and there is a preliminary paper on this, a review of how they're going to deal with developing countries. And it's a signal to us to make sure we're on the agenda somewhere, not just take it for granted. Okay, the second question was foreign direct investment from China, the lessons. Yes, I don't want this to sound like advertisement, but I did a paper about 6 months ago about Chinese foreign direct investments. It's published by the Inter-American Development Bank. In there I said there's the following things. One, China is not a monolith of state enterprises. There are a range of private sector firms. Some are huge and some are small. And you have private investors. So the fact that the Caribbean is small doesn't mean it won't attract some of the investors, because some of them are small. Some of them come in the form of setting up a wholesale distribution or a Chinese restaurant. That ranges up to firms that are huge, bigger than any economy in the Caribbean. There are lessons on both sides. Some of the failures that I mentioned in foreign direct investment. Remember, foreign direct investment from the US, Canada, Brazil, Mexico, they also have failures. But the Chinese are new to this business. They have to learn. We also in the Caribbean have to learn how to deal with them and what conditions we set to maximize their input. But I think that it's a teething process. There's so much foreign direct investment coming out of China. There's enough to go around. The One Belt is a significant, good morning, Minister. Thank you for gracing us with your presence. The One Belt is a new, very significant project for China. China has been in a process of global repositioning, along with Asia, as the center of gravity of the global economy shifts towards Asia. This project is intended to engage a part of the world which has been relatively neglected. It's a great opportunity. It's going to be state-driven in terms of the capital that goes into it initially. I think that China is so large that there's enough capital, private and public, to go around. I don't think the One Belt, which is not going to start tomorrow, I don't think it's going to deprive the Chinese of having money. Remember too, there's a whole part of the economy that's not controlled by the state. You see the recent normalization of relations between Panama and China. That is a signal that China, which has been expanding into ports, shipping and trade, sees Panama as a major change. It didn't just happen like that. Panama has been recognized in Taiwan from the 1950s. This is something that's being driven by investment. So my answer about the One Belt, it's a major project, but it's not going to exclude. Remember, there's always the Taiwan-China rivalry. If you understand the Chinese psyche, they are never going to give up Taiwan. They're going to always regard it as a rogue province. And time in the Eastern mind is not 10 or 50 years. Time in the Eastern mind is hundreds of years. That is why when Nixon asked Zhou Enlai, referring to the 1960s riots in Paris, what do you think of the French Revolution? And Zhou Enlai said, it's too early to tell.
This is a team effort. You will see we are all UNDP colleagues from across the Caribbean, and actually this conference was made possible because of the collaboration of all my colleagues, deputies, from here, Guyana, Trinidad, Suriname, Barbados, etc. So we have together prepared something, and Ken Roy, of course, is our boss in New York. Our coordinator for the maps. So he's going to start, everybody will say something about the experience of having a map in their individual country. So we thought it's better, rather than having just one person present, that each of us be given a chance to say something about how UNDP has supported or will be supporting the governments in each country office. So the presenters are, as you know, and the outline is as follows. We're going to start first with Ken Roy, who's going to give us an overall framework of the maps, what it is. So he's going to set the tone, and then we'll be going into individual country example, and then we're going to finalize the presentation with an actual center of excellence that has been put in place in Aruba. So over to you, Ken Roy.
I'm going to be very disciplined.
Okay.
Colleagues can talk a lot. This is not a six-person panel.
We have just
So
2 minutes.
we have 15 minutes to sort of make sure we get through the presentation, and then we'll do a bit of Q&A. But please be very disciplined, not long.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everyone. I'll try to take advantage of every second, Richard, don't worry. So first, thank you so much for coming to this presentation. And, this mainstreaming acceleration policy support work that we've been doing here in the Caribbean, I believe is really making a very useful contribution to the region. Just to sort of set up the presentation very quickly, I'm not going to go through the principles of the SDGs. I think most of us know that. But just to say a couple of things about the motivation behind the work that we're doing here in the Caribbean. Of course, the first is the fact that as a region mainly made up of small island developing states, we recognize that the agenda is very ambitious and that it would require some creative ways if we were to gain progress fast, and if we were to be able to address the complex task of implementing the SDG. The issues that we spoke about, for example, yesterday around financing, the issues around how to bring the integration between social, economic, environment, the issues around implementation would require some new ways of thinking about the SDG agenda. And so what we're hoping to achieve with this joined up presentation is to show some concrete examples of how we're addressing these practical challenges. Just to say that the MAPS, the Mainstreaming Acceleration Policy Support work, MAPS actually comes from the UN Development Group, UNDG, and it's the UN development systems offer to member states on the SDGs. What comes out of the MAPS process, as you'll hear from the examples to be presented, is a roadmap which basically helps countries around 6 key issues. The first is alignment, and that is looking at the extent to which the SDG goals and targets are currently reflected in the national development plans and strategies. We recognize that the SDGs is not entirely new, that in fact many countries are already pursuing many of the elements of the SDGs. And so by doing this rapid integrated assessment, it helps to do a diagnostic around how many of the SDG goals and targets are not currently being addressed in existing strategies and plans, which then helps countries in terms of identifying those gaps to be addressed going forward. An important issue for the Caribbean has been the issue of acceleration, or how do we increase the rate of development progress across the region. And therefore, in these SDG roadmaps, there's a strong focus on what are those critical interventions that can touch many goals and targets at the same time, and that have a great chance of driving a faster rate of development progress. Of course, financing the agenda is a major issue. The presentation we just heard from Richard Bernal spoke in great detail about that. The other element to this is monitoring and reporting, and here it's about the challenge of data and evidence-based decision making and helping countries to develop the data ecosystem to be able to plan and report on the progress on SDGs, but more broadly, be able to plan in an evidence-based way across the different sectors. And then just finally to touch on the 2 other elements, engagement and coordination. Engagement is about building a whole of society response to the SDGs, recognizing that it's not only government, it's not a responsibility only of governments, but it would require private sector and other domestic actors, and indeed international actors' support to drive the agenda. And then finally, the challenge of how do we get coordination and integration? How do we actually bring economic, social environment together to harness the benefits of joined up policy making? And what kinds of new architecture, which fundamentally speaks to the issue of silos. How do we break down silos, and how do we reorganize public policy architecture for the SDGs? So I'm going to leave it there and hand it over in the interest of time to, I believe it's Sharifa next. Just go into some examples of how we're doing these things.
Thank you, Kenroy, and good morning. Richard is my boss, so I'm going to have to comply with not speaking a whole lot. So if we move along to the accelerators, and I was asked to just speak a bit about the accelerators in Trinidad and Tobago. We had a MAPS mission in late April, and 5 accelerators were identified. And these are really priority areas which, when addressed, can have multiple developmental impacts and a multiplier effect. When you look at the accelerators there, you would see that it's very closely aligned to Trinidad and Tobago's Vision 2030 development plan. So for instance, you'd see strength and competitiveness and productivity on the lower left, my lower left, and inclusive growth. With Trinidad and Tobago, you have building globally competitive businesses. Similarly, placing environment at the center of development. We're looking at an accelerator that looks at land and coastal management. What we've done as well is to align each of the SDGs that relate to the particular accelerator. So in looking at each accelerator, it's actually very closely aligned to the 5 development pillars for Trinidad and Tobago's Vision 2030, and then linked to each SDG. So we're just going to take one of those accelerators, and the accelerator is improving performance of the social protection system. So that's one accelerator that was identified. It's linked to the Vision 2030, Trinidad and Tobago's development plan, that pillar that speaks to people, putting people first, nurturing our greatest asset. The first thing that was done would have been the review of documents, as Kenroy said. Consultations were done in country, as well as bilateral meetings with the agencies and ministries involved in the social protection system. You would see the issues and the challenges that are identified there. Fragmentation of programs, which is very, very critical, where one program, once the clients leave one program, there is not a seamless, interaction and engagement with another program. So you may have a child who may be getting social assistance. As that child turns 18, is that person now going to join one of the employment programs, skills development programs, so that you have that seamless connection? So people may drop off one program but not necessarily get onto another. Barriers to entry in terms of accessing some of the services, that's always an issue. There are about 200 social programs in Trinidad and Tobago, and that accounts for a significant amount of GDP and expenditure in the budget. There's weak coordination in the system and no path toward productive employment. Evidence-based policy does not really exist, and therefore that accounts for a very inefficient and not cost-effective system. So what has been proposed? We're looking at optimizing the performance of the social protection sector, and you would see the various interventions. So we look at program consolidation. If we have 200 programs, how can we consolidate those programs, make them more effective, efficient, targeted, and so forth? Remove barriers of entry. There are specific groups that cannot access the programs, perhaps people in rural areas who do not know about the programs, who don't have knowledge of the programs. One of the ways to get that is to have social workers reach out to these people so that you actually take the programs to the people. Improve coordination with other sectors, linking to productive employment. And this is very important because you want to be able to promote, to have people develop the capacity so that they can become productive members of society, achieving our goal of inclusive growth and promoting economic growth. Having buffers in the system as well is very important so that we're able to, especially in periods of economic decline, to be able to increase and stabilize household income and aggregate demand for the economy. Strengthen evidence base. This is very important for us to be able to get the information, because we know sometimes some people may access several programs, and to be able to have that single registry of beneficiaries so that we, across the social sector, because it's not one ministry that's running, it's several ministries and agencies, we can have one single registry of beneficiaries which we would be able, where we would be able to better target and have a more effective system. So I'll stop there right now and we take questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sharifa. I'm just going to mention about Jamaica's experience. We had the first MAPS mission in the Caribbean in December of this year. And that MAPS mission actually came with several recommendations, and a roadmap was developed and approved by the Planning Institute of Jamaica. Now, what I'm going to focus on is the after MAPS, the support that UNDP is providing to the government. We were able to access some funding windows from our headquarters to support 3 areas of implementation of the SDGs. So what we did is we developed a project with the government with these 3 outputs. One being coordination mechanism. We're trying to strengthen to help them put in place a strong coordination mechanism for implementation of the SDGs. The second one is really to increase advocacy and awareness around the SDGs throughout Jamaica. And the third one is to really improve quality of data, which is a recommendation that came out as an accelerator from the MAPS mission. And you would see that all 3 outputs of these projects are aligned with Vision 2030 Jamaica, as well as the Multi-Country Sustainable Development Framework outcome and our UNDP Strategic Plan 2014-17. Now, on the first output, What we are still working on with the government is to make sure that a strong coordination structure is in place. So with PIOJ, we're working on having a core group, SDGs core group, that includes all the relevant ministries under the high authority of the Prime Minister is the top, and then you have the DG, the Director General of PIOJ, with Ministry of Foreign Affairs and major ministries. So there is an oversight committee that's actually meeting to monitor implementation of the SDGs. So there will be quarterly meetings. We have them put in place in terms of reference. And the intent is to ensure that the 2030 agenda issues are integrated into Vision 2030 and that they are monitored on a constant basis. There are focal points in all 11 sectors that have been identified, and what we have actually helped this year particularly will be to submit their first national SDG report. So they're working on it. We are working together on this as we speak. In terms of the second output, which is the awareness, the coordination and raising awareness of the SDG, what we've noticed is that not everybody knows about SDGs, not only in Jamaica, but everywhere. So the intention there is to make sure that there is a wide knowledge from whatever sector of SDGs throughout Jamaica, not Kingston, but throughout Jamaica. So it's really to support the government in integrating the SDGs in the work of their thematic working groups, and whilst doing that, to ensure that there is a wider knowledge in the society of SDGs. Part of it will include having audiovisual materials on the SDGs, going to the schools, going to the parishes, having campaigns. And then one of the things that we're going to be presenting later today is what we call the concept of artists for the SDGs. So there will be musicians, Jamaican musicians, groups that are going to vehicle the words of the SDGs. So whenever there are events around Jamaica, some of the musicians would be asked to join and then to include some messages in the music throughout Jamaica. That could be a good practice for other countries in the region. And of course, this regional conference. Now, the last one is in terms of data quality. Sharifa mentioned accelerator for Trinidad. It has been one of the accelerator that came out of the MAPS mission that we needed to ensure better and higher quality of data. So what we are trying to do, we'll be doing this year, later on in October, is a training with some workshops with ministries, development, and agencies that are engaged in the production of SDG indicators. So that's going to be done in the last quarter of this year, and we are going to have to work with consultants like Paris 21. Serge had made a presentation yesterday on data, so we'll be working with Paris 21 to do this. So this is the ongoing support to Jamaica that we are going to try to go to take into 2018 and others, but of course, financing will be a major issue. Thank you.
I'll go straight to the point. For Guyana, a bit of an experience. Guyana, as we speak, is transitioning from the LCDS, which is the Low Carbon Development Strategy, to the GSDS, which is the Green State Development Strategy. We have too many acronyms. So LCDS to GSDS, quickly. And then that transition, there has been some overarching vision, is that is the 2030 vision for Guyana's, which will be aligned with the with the GSDS, with the SDG. And this 2030 development agenda would include Guyana's energy transition plan. The core of it includes the well-being of all Guyanese, and that is good life for all. It will also build on green and inclusive industrial transformation, shifting to a more diversified economy, better education, governance, and of course, gains from all the resource extraction. And as you know, Guyana by 2020 on the cusp of getting the oil exploration. It is also going to look into the finance and investment mechanism, and our colleagues in the UNEP, which is UN Environment, is leading this process and the formulation of the GSDS. From UNDP, and this is where the guru, our Kendroy, is involved. For the maps, there was a planning for a rapid integrated assessment that UNDP will be leading in Guyana. That is being part of it. At the same time, in UN country team in Guyana is proposing to submit a $50 million plan for 2017-2020 on sustainable development for a green Guyana. And this joint program is under discussion, and that will fall under the MSDS, under the 4 category of inclusive, equitable, and prosperous Guyana, safe, just, and cohesive Guyana, healthy Guyana, and sustainable and resilient Guyana. Thank you. The second one is quickly to add is that there is a plan. I haven't yet completed, Richard. There is a plan, and this is part of the government plan of decentralization, and that means the conversation of having satellite towns and not just everything development based out of Georgetown. The plan of action for regional development, or PARD, and the plan of action for municipal development are some of the regional plans that's been undergoing as we speak. SDG mainstreaming is part of those discussions, and how do we do that? We will use the curated tools that has been developed by UNDG, and that would be inclusive of awareness, raising and diagnostics, mainstreaming of SDGs in the PARD and the PAMDS, the macro-micro link, which is to connect GSDS to the SDG, and the PARD and the PMD subsequently to the GSDS, and of course the SDG integration across the board. So there are 10 regions in Guyana, and this is a conversation undergoing with the Minister of Communities, Minister of Finance, as of course with the UN country team, and of course UNDP. Thank you very much. Over to you.
The SDGs in Suriname has actually not gone through the MAPS mission, and therefore we started off with a process that pretty much involves a localization exercise, and this is pretty much based on an experiential model at the community level, where community action is being recorded, as well as a targeted capacity to achieve the SDGs with rural women, local councils, and in Suriname that is called the district commissioners' offices, as well as youth. So the photograph that you would have seen before, this is a photograph of a card game that has been developed to engage young people, school children, in understanding the 17 SDGs. And you know, we don't have the time for me to explain to you what that game entails, but we have developed a card game, and that has been going very well with the students. So our intervention is based on youth participation, creating awareness, and widening and deepening the understanding of the SDGs through this card game that I mentioned. We've had a symposium, a bit of a dry run actually to this conference, where we invited academics from Cuba, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, French Guiana, and Brazil, and that was held in November of last year, in excess of 150 participants, and we have since published a small journal with the Anton de Kom University of Suriname, sorry. We've done a number of briefing sessions, particularly with the National Assembly of Suriname, with the Council of Ministers. We've also had a press event to raise the awareness of members of the local media in Suriname on the values of the SDGs and how they can engage in SDG reporting. We've had sessions with the private sector, and looking at particularly small enterprise development and the role of small enterprise development in meeting some of the livelihood elements of the SDGs. Training sessions for working groups on localizing the SDGs. We've worked with a number of rural women in the local language. And let me just again go back to that slide. You will see at the top it says SDG Giyu, SDG Gimi, SDG Gi We Allah, Gi One Better Tomorrow. I hope, Michael, I said that correctly. This is Sranan Tongo, the local language of Suriname, and we use the local language in popularizing the SDGs. We've done a number of issues across the board with awareness and advocacy, as well as sessions with major groups, for example, the indigenous peoples, the tribal peoples of Suriname, and targeted audiences across the board. So this is in a sense what we've done on localizing, and our intention is that will now be fed into the national prioritization of the SDGs, where the government will now determine from those experiences what are the SDGs that it will be prioritizing for reporting towards 2030. Thank you.
Okay, and now we come to the OECS.
My name is Chisa Mikami. My office covers Barbados and 9 Eastern Caribbean countries which are OECS members. But yeah, because of the time that I take only one example, which is Grenada, awareness raising, and through South-South cooperation. As part of the SDG mainstreaming activity, the government of Grenada organized 3-day awareness raising sessions titled Mainstreaming the Sustainable Development Goals for National Development in September last year. And to organize this event, the government of Grenada approached the UNDP Sub-Regional Office for Barbados and Mauritius and request for support. So UNDP, as a knowledge network and broker, and also promoting South-South cooperation, brought an expert on the SDGs from Panama Regional Hub, and also invited a resource person from Suriname to share her experience of the SDG localization with Grenadians. Because after this session, the 40 senior government officials, 5 parliamentarians, and the 15 local partners were trained. And the UNDP sub-regional office is now in discussion with the government of Grenada to organize a MAPS mission during the course of this year, and also with St. Lucia. We also received a request from Antigua and Barbuda and St. Kitts and Nevis. So we will tailor and customize the support around the SDGs based on the needs of each one of the countries. So.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd like to share with you guys an UNDP initiative that started last year, focused on the concept of South-South cooperation. It's an initiative with partners, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the government of Aruba, and UNDP to set up a knowledge-sharing platform, because we all know that SIDS have specific or similarities or challenges. For example, many SIDS depend on tourism, and a lot of depend on imports. So creating a platform where we can all connect. So what can this platform do for you? What do we do? On the SDGs, we collect, there's a lot of fragmented information publications specifically on SIDS out there. For the different topics, for the 17 goals, what we've done is we've collected all of these, and you can find them on our virtual platform where they are tagged according to the SDGs, making it more easily available for policymakers and their teams to find these types of informations that are fragmented out there. Besides that, we've also worked with other partners to develop case studies to share solutions, sustainable solutions. And these are all also tagged according to the main SDGs. We also try to connect the policymakers with each other. Last year for our inaugural training, we are a relatively new knowledge platform, we invited the 38 UN member SIDS, one policymaker from each island, to come and receive a training on building sustainable roadmaps. This was held in Aruba last year, and this is a picture of the group. This is to first start the community. Because we cannot always do face-to-face training, this requires much more financial resources, we keep connecting through our virtual platform. We have a monthly newsletter where we curate information specifically that are of interest for SIDS, the crossroads between SIDS and SDGs. And so the website is sustainablesids.org. And for partnerships, we collaborate with different institutions to be able to provide the service for the islands. So for example, partners would be TNO, who gave the training, and this year we'll be providing 7 in-country technical assistants. We also collaborate with the OECS for building case studies, one being, for example, the marine park that has been established in Grenada. So in this way, we try to enable sharing between the islands and through this knowledge platform. Thank you.
Any discussion, quick discussion on the context of maps, the different country experiences, things that surprised you, things that you liked? Obviously yesterday we heard from the Prime Minister of Jamaica that The cabinet was discussing the MAPS report last week, so it'd be interesting to see. Maybe the Minister of Foreign Affairs, you might want to just give us a view as to beyond what the Prime Minister said. You know, because I think landing this agenda is the big question. You know, small countries, limited resources. You know, really, does it have political traction? You know, you've got many other local things to be worrying about and priorities. But anyhow, the floor is open for questions or comments.
Cleveland Thomas from the ITU, and thanks for the presentation. Just a quick observation. With the different roadmaps and the experiences that were articulated, what did not come across too clearly is the extent to which there is coordination among the different groups. So for instance, we heard of Suriname, where they spoke of the card game to learn the 17 SDGs, and the extent to which that, as an example, might be useful to also replicate in other regional countries. And I heard individual roadmap in individual jurisdictions, but what did not come across is the extent of the coordination among the different groups. I'd like to just hear a bit about that.
Thank you. My question's really about data and how that might relate to measuring progress towards the goals. One of the problems of many of the small island states, as well as the LDCs and so on, is a lack of capacity to be able to measure all the data that are required to go through all 17 goals and all, I forget how many, 100 and odd targets. So are you going to be looking at ways in which they can reduce the number of goals or targets that they have to track? Otherwise, all that's going to happen, it seems to me, is that there will be an incomplete collection of data. SIDS will drop off the GSDR and other similar reports, or the UN will be forced to try to find large sums of money to help produce these reports. Now, that's traditionally what you've done in cases like when you're reporting on, say, climate change and so on, but it doesn't work very well. And so I'm very interested to hear, and it's not so much a question related to Jamaica, because Jamaica is fairly good at collecting the data, but I'm very concerned about all the other SIDS, many of which have yet even to be able to come up with enough data to be included on reduced data sets.
Good morning, colleagues. Janelle Scanhabari-Munzi from Barbados. I am on the technical working group for the SDG indicators through CARICOM. The idea is to have Caribbean-specific SDGs which relate directly, the issues relate directly to the CARICOM states. We know there are challenges within the NSOs, but it is for countries to determine what they can do consistently, what pertains to them, because not all of the indicators relate to countries specifically, but it comes down to the country to determine what they want to do and what they are able to do well and can report, because this is a long agenda. So and I'm sure you want to have historical data to show how we are moving, and we want to have data that is done consistently. So it comes down to the country to determine what they are able to produce and to report on consistently.
Having heard yesterday and partially also today about the issue in the Caribbean region about indebtedness and interest in attracting investment from abroad and so on, it all makes sense to me. And how does this then relate to the SDG work that you do? Because one word that I haven't heard from any of the speakers is, to what extent do you suggest that MAPS and all the other suggestions that you're making to governments would lead to competitiveness of the countries? So is it, not just costs, not just doing good, and all of that is very good that you're suggesting things to do to make the societies more whole and more sustainable, but they also need to stay competitive. And a lot of times the enterprises that I have been in touch with first of all, they don't know about SDGs in general, and two, they will say, well, that just is going to hinder my competitiveness. I have to do more things that cost me. What is it that you can help me understand that if I do apply and implement SDGs, I will still stay in the game?
I have to say that, you know, I speak all the time and I really treasure opportunities to just listen and learn. I really do. So I hadn't really planned to make any comments this morning. But to indicate, as has been pointed out, Jamaica is well underway in its project. And the PIOJ, or Planning Institute of Jamaica, just this week, Monday, had presented the roadmap project to Cabinet for approval, proposing also one of the elements they sought approval of was a public education campaign, a sensitization campaign, seeking to engage all levels of society, all stakeholders, in not only understanding but working towards. But generally speaking, I think one of the things, and this probably relates to the point Professor Sena is making, but not in relation specifically to competitiveness. I think one of the challenges that we have is where we are seeking to achieve so many goals, and if we have ambitiously committed and recognized that all are necessary for us to reach, to have the Caribbean we want, or the world that we want. How do we order our steps? When I looked at Trinidad's map of accelerators, everything makes sense. I've looked at all the dots that you had connected, and everything makes sense. But when you think about ordering steps where resources are constrained, and this is not, a whining session about how are we going to fund, but acknowledging constraints. When resources are scarce, you must allocate appropriately, and you must order your steps in a way that has expenditure makes sense, and you get your bang for the buck in organized steps that will ultimately result in your goal. And I never seem to get quite a sense, even when we're measuring and I look at our indicators, what we have data on, what we don't, what we need to make more progress on, and where we've reached. I don't get a sense that we are, and this is across the board, that we are considering how do we make this workable, acknowledging where we are. So we speak about funding at this level as a constraint, and we speak about data mining as a constraint. But do we focus on 8 and 16 first to make sure that we're able to reach 1? Is 17, 8, and 16, do they work most logically together to reach to the rest? But a dragnet approach rather than a spearfishing approach where we are acknowledging resource constraints makes me concerned at every step, in every presentation on these matters. Is the UNDP, has any analysis been done, whether regionally or at a broader level? Has any analysis been done as to the logical order within which small island developing states should focus? Or is it even possible to do that, given, yes, we have lots of similarities, but there are peculiarities as well, or unique circumstances as well? Has any analysis been done on the order in which we should focus on implementing a roadmap for maximum effectiveness, or most likelihood, greatest likelihood of attaining the goals?
Thank you very much, Richard. Alison Drayton, UNFPA. I was just going to say, somewhat in response to the minister, but also in terms of what I heard, that I think coming from the New York lens on the negotiations of the SDGs, it was very clear, based on the MDG experience, that there was no possibility of any country being able to hit all 17 of these. And I have been very concerned yesterday and into this morning on the sense of the Caribbean, which, we've noted, small islands, small regions have unique challenges, of this thing of we have to hit all 17 to prove that we are trying, because that, if you will forgive me for being blunt, is a recipe for failure. And part of the exercise of the SDGs and the complexity is to allow the countries to figure out what in each case are that particular country's needed accelerators. In some countries, it's going to be gender equity. In other countries, it's going to be infrastructure, etc. And figure out what are your 3 or 4 accelerators which you target for resources, and those drag as much as possible of the rest behind. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for the questions. If I may, I just want to start with the Honorable Minister's question and ordering and how to prioritize. This is precisely why we focus so much in this approach on accelerators. This is exactly what underpins our thinking behind accelerators. And what we didn't do with this presentation is actually go through the mechanics of how we arrive at the accelerators, which I think would address some of the underlying concerns that we have. We do recognize that it is not possible, and I think this speaks a little bit to Alison's question, that it is not possible to implement programming that will address all 169 targets and 17 goals at the same time. And so the key question when we were designing the approach was precisely, is there a theory of change around where it makes sense to start? And that brought us to the point on what we call acceleration. And there is a particular methodology which we call combos, which is about what is the combination of interventions that countries can pursue that can have the multiple impact across a number of goals and targets. Sorry, apologies. So it's precisely that. And so what we try to do both through empirical, quantitative and qualitative analysis is to come up with that theory of change. And this is one of the fundamental points. So for example, on the issue of growth and competitiveness, when we went to Trinidad, for example, the government said to us, you know, we have identified some growth sectors where we believe the next wave of economic growth is going to come from for Trinidad. And when we spoke with the private sector, one of the things that was very, very clear is that notwithstanding whatever sector you focus on, that there were some underlying drivers of competitiveness that had to be addressed. And so instead of us proposing in the roadmap sector by sector strategy, which we don't believe is practical and realistic in the short term, we sought to identify what are those underlying issues linked to competitiveness, like the ease of doing business, access to financing, de-risking certain strategic investments, etc., that can have an impact. But also, and this speaks a little bit to the SDG agenda, how does pursuing economic strategies link to the government's ambition on the social side and on the environmental side? And this is where the issue of trade-offs. So part of the approach is an analysis around, you know, if you pursue this track, this economic track, what are the trade-offs that the country needs to make on the environmental side and on the social side? And therefore trying to identify those interventions that have, for example, the minimum impact on the environment, or at least to be cognizant of what is the impact on the environment and how that connects with the social indicators and so on. So at the heart of what we're trying to do with the SDG roadmaps is identify what are the key accelerators linked to as many strategies, as many of the goals and targets. And Alison, you're perfectly right. In all of the cases so far, the 3 cases, we landed with 3 or 4 accelerators. Okay? And so instead of trying to address the whole agenda, we say what are the 3 or 4 critical development interventions that can be pursued in the next 3 to 5 years that have the biggest impact on as many of the SDG goals and targets. And so if you interrogate the SDG roadmaps, hopefully you'll see. The other issue, just very quickly to touch on, is on the financing issue. Of course, because of the high indebtedness, lack of access to concessional financing, and so on, many of the countries have said to us, yes, but how are we going to fund this? And so a part of this that we really didn't I just sort of brushed by it in my presentation this morning, is precisely on what are the public and private sources, international and domestic, sources of financing that countries can have access to. So for example, in Jamaica, we spent a lot of time looking at, for example, how do we tap into venture capital financing? How do we tap into social impact investment? How do we tap into diaspora bonds as some other examples of some other sources of financing that we could develop to address some of the SDGs. In the case of Aruba, it was about how do we support the government on restructuring, in the negotiations and restructuring the debt with the Netherlands, for example. So really helping countries to think through what are the financing options given the limited fiscal space and where to make those, where to invest the energy to be able to attract additional finance. Just one last point on financing. We do recognize that in the Caribbean, there is going to be an issue around private sector financing and how to attract private sector financing for the SDGs. There are some goals, for example, goal number 9, which speaks to infrastructure and ICT, for example, that we believe is ripe for private sector financing. But when we have this discussion with governments, what we're realizing is that the business case has not necessarily been made as yet around these sectors. You know, private sector wants to know about the return on investment, wants to know about, you know, the level of capital, the kinds of incentives that need to be provided in these sectors so that they can invest. So I think the region has to do some homework around how do we make the business case around some strategic areas for SDG financing.
Okay, great. So I'm going to close the session now because we need to hear to the other 2 speakers, and then we will hopefully have some time at the end to sort of pick up if there are any discussion. And of course, you can meet bilaterally any of the individuals. So just reminder, yesterday there was a major session on data. Yeah. So anybody who didn't attend the data session, I'm sure it's online. Have a look at it, and that might address. I think the lady at the back made a good stab at it in terms of what CARICOM is doing. But it's all you know, it's all work in progress, and Serge is here as well, that people can connect to him as well. On sharing experiences, it's a great question. I mean, that's what this panel has been all about, but you know, we can always do better at doing that, to be able to be very liquid so that countries can quickly, you know, find some best practice and use it. So thank you very much, everybody from UNDP. Let's give them a clap, and let's bring the other 2 panel members. Aura Robinson, who's going to be speaking next. He's going to be speaking about incorporating the outlying countries towards an inclusive and equitable migration policy, which is obviously a very important and interesting topic.
I'm most uncomfortable presenting here today. I usually present about this topic when I'm in Canada because people don't know much about CARICOM, but here I am in front of you and you're all experts. So you know more about this than I know about it myself. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to be talking about incorporating the outlying countries and how do we get to an inclusive and equitable migration policy in the Caribbean. And because you all know more about this than I do, what I'm going to do is share from the perspective of intra-CARICOM migrants. So this presentation is based on my PhD research from 2 years ago, and I interviewed people who were CARICOM migrants who lived in other CARICOM countries for at least 2 months, just to model the European model, how they do the Eurobarometer. And my presentation is going to give the voice of these people that I've spoken to. So I've zoomed in on SDG 10.7, and it talks about the promotion of orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and the mobility of people, including through the implementation of planned and well-managed migration system. Now, this SDG 10.7 most countries, including CARICOM countries, they've signed on to the Migration Governance Framework, which actually provides some guidelines onto policy domains on how this particular SDG can be managed. So I won't speak too much about that today. You can ask questions about this later. Before I get into the findings, though, in terms of the outline countries, most of you know, for analytical purposes, we tend to classify CARICOM countries in 3 groups. We have the outline, which would be Bahamas, Belize, Haiti, and Suriname. And then we have the OECS, and then the Big 4, Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Guyana. So I'm going to be focusing on the outline countries. Now, I'm looking at 2 types of data here. One, survey data, and the way I've done this is to break down the countries into the 3 groups. And the interview data, because it's a PhD research, funding is limited, so I had to prioritize. What I did was interview people from Belize and from Suriname, so I'm not getting the full representation there in the interview data. Some points to note. Why are we talking about incorporating the outline countries? If we look at the HDI, and unfortunately my USB is not working, so you can't see the visual, but you'd see that most of the outline countries, with the exception of the Bahamas, they tend to rank at the closer to the bottom of the CARICOM table. Another point to note, if we look at the social progress indicator, which is being advocated now as a better measure of equality than the Human Development Index, one thing that you'd find is that Jamaica is the only CARICOM country that actually has a ranking, and that's because we're the only country that has data on all the indicators. So that's something to bear in mind as we go. All right, so what am I interested in? Well, I want to figure out, how do these intra-CARICOM migrants, how do they experience migration in these other countries? Are they more or less attached to CARICOM? And how do they narrate their lived experiences? What can we learn about these things? And how do we translate these learning into a equitable and prosperous Caribbean? I'll just point out 3 limitations very quickly before I get into the findings. One, it's perception. I'm measuring perceptions here, so it's really subjective. 2, the sample is really small. We're talking about a sample of just over 200 people, and it's not based on probability technique. So there will be some issues there around generalization. And the third thing is that because respondents volunteered and because they had to live in these countries for some period of time, we're really talking about regular migrants. So irregular migrants would have been excluded from this study. So just to point out some of the quick findings in terms of attachments to CARICOM, what I've found here is that respondents from the outlying countries were the most attached, and this was statistically significant. I used ANOVA and chi-squares and regression analysis. It's very consistent across the board. The Big 4 countries were least attached. If we look at attachment to receiving countries, though, no change. The results are not statistically significant. What this means is that regardless of where you're from or where you go, this doesn't affect how attached you are to the country that you're in. But in terms of how people feel about these countries, whether or not they feel like they belonged in these countries, what I found was that, and this was statistically significant, people from the outlying countries felt like they belonged more. In terms of their lived experiences, they felt like they had more positive lived experiences than other people from the OECS or from the Big 4 countries. In terms of integration, CARICOM migrants generally overall do not feel integrated in these other countries. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Yeah. This is it. Oh. So in terms of people from Belize and Suriname, it was the same result. They were more attached to CARICOM than other CARICOM nationals. They felt, and this was statistically significant, they had more positive lived experiences than other CARICOM member countries. So here is the conundrum. If they are more attached, why are we talking about incorporating them? And this was where the interviews actually kind of added some flesh to this. So most of my respondents here, they felt like CARICOM is good. Being a part of a CARICOM community is good for them personally, it's good for their countries, it opens up opportunities. They felt like the cultures are similar. And so it's easy to really live in another CARICOM countries. However, when asked to describe their lived experiences, this was where it was problematic. And a number of hurdles were identified. One was exclusion. And I'm going to read some of the quotes from my respondents. I'm reading here from Brenda. She's from Belize and she was living in Barbados at the time of the interviews. And she said, a lot of people didn't know about Belize. The way they looked at it, Belize just had Hispanic people. And that's the belief they had. And she identified as someone who's black. I'm quoting here from Sheila. She's from Suriname and she lived here in Jamaica for a couple of years. And she said, talking to people and telling them that, yes, we Suriname are a part of CARICOM and we're CARICOM nationals, they'll be like, oh, really? You have to explain to them that Suriname is not actually in Africa, but it is in South America, and that it has been a part of CARICOM for a long time. She said, I think the language, it's okay. I think the language, makes it a little bit difficult. It's hard for them to accept that we are part of an English-speaking community. So one of the big things was
That's on now, so just blink to where you've got to.
okay.
And you've got about 5 more minutes.
Okay. So I'm right there. All right. So a lot of them felt excluded based on the fact that people in other countries did not recognize them as legitimate members of CARICOM, and they felt this sense of alienation. And this led to one of the more dominant themes that came out of the interviews, and it's the lack of knowledge or ignorance. And they felt like this was pervasive even at the government level. I'm going to read a few quotes here. I'm reading here from Sam. He's from Suriname and he lived in Guyana and Trinidad. And he said, he lived in Guyana, and he said, I have family in Trinidad also. I look forward to visiting those countries. But as I've told you before, that we have to find out more about those countries. What is available? What is possible in these countries? You need that information before you travel. There is very little information. The stream of information is very poor. All the countries, I think, there's a lack of information because I have friends on Facebook too from other CARICOM countries, and few of them know about Suriname. Also, a lot of my Surinamese friends did not even know that Guyana exists in CARICOM. And I'm quoting here from Barry. He's from Belize, lived in Barbados, and he said, speaking of how he felt in Barbados, he said, the people do not allow you to feel like you belong. You feel like you do not belong here because they do not know anything about you. And then some people talk about even at the airports, at the ports of entry, the immigration officials were unwilling to give them 6 months because they just didn't know. And this was experienced by quite a number of migrants from these countries. They spoke about being given 3 months. And I'm reading here from respondent Sarah. She's from Suriname. She said, I think you have to train them, speaking about the immigration officials, and let them know that we are CARICOM national, that we have a right here to stay for 6 months without permits. She was talking about not being given enough time. So a lot of what we find here was that respondents were talking about the lack of information. They talked about the fact that only some countries had the resources or had CARICOM institutions, so they are better known. And the fact that we do not recognize the contribution of migrants towards development of both settlement and origin countries, which leads me to make these recommendations around how do we use this information to actually guide our policy or to develop partnerships. And one of the first things that I would recommend is better collection of data. That's a dominant theme here. But as I've said before, some countries do a better job, or some countries have more data available publicly. I think we need to develop partnerships to see how we can bring everyone up to the same standard, some amount of standardization around data collection, and this will allow us to better understand migration and the impact of migration. Some of the things that we need to know are socio-demographics of the people who are moving. We need to know the nature of this migration. Is it circular migration? Is it transnational? Is it permanent? Because that will determine our attitude towards intra-CARICOM migration. We need to understand the impact as well, and these data should be available, like the social and economic impact. Remittance is an example, and of course we need to know more about the experiences. Which leads me to talk about building capacities and reducing the knowledge gap that seems to be pervasive. Some of my recommendations would be we should have more information campaign that would really talk about rights and responsibilities of migrants, because SDG 10.7 addresses those things, and it's important for people to know, to have the information before they travel or when they are in these countries. People also need to know the pathways towards migration to other countries so that there are no misinformation, and they need information about settlement. So I'm suggesting that we partner with regional enterprises. We have companies that are right across the Caribbean, and they move people from countries to countries from time to time. That they can be a voice to mainstream the positive narrations about migration. We need to mainstream the positives about it. Partnerships with civil society. How I gathered my respondents was partnered with migrant organizations in some of these countries. For example, the Jamaican Association in Barbados, they were instrumental. I think we need to incorporate those kind of organizations more, and they can play an important role in terms of disseminating information and spreading this positive narrative. So finally, I'm suggesting that, and this is kind of controversial, but we need to think really about expanding the migration categories. Right now, there are only limited amount of people who can move across. It's important for us to think about setting goals and targets and see how we can do that and better disseminate information. I believe that those things can contribute towards SDG 10, promotion of safe and orderly migration.
We're going to take a few questions on this. Just to state one thing before we go into a discussion, 2013 was the first intra-Caribbean dialogue on migration, and then one happened again in December last year. The International Organization of Migration and UNHCR with CARICOM gave some support to that. This is the only region in the world that hasn't had a dynamic forum on migration questions. So it's a positive thing that that has been restarted in the Caribbean, that there is that discussion going on amongst policymakers, and you can find the documentation online from IOM. about those meetings, the background papers and results.
Thank you very much. Colin Murdoch, Antigua and Barbuda. I want to thank the presenter. I found the information and the perspective very interesting. What I'd like to do is to tell you a little bit about the most integrated country in CARICOM, which is Antigua and Barbuda. Yes. Yes. Antigua and Barbuda, with a population of approximately 100,000, has thousands of CARICOM nationals, thousands of Jamaicans, thousands of people from St. Vincent, from Dominica, from the Dominican Republic. In fact, it is estimated that 20% of our population comes from the Dominican Republic. We have 3 Spanish language radio stations. We play baseball in the Pan American Baseball League. When there are elections in Dominica, the politicians campaign in Antigua. Our Commissioner of Police is from St. Vincent. Our Chief Immigration Officer is from St. Vincent. We don't fuss about these things anymore. It's a fact of life. So I want just to present this picture because I realize that your samples were taken from a very small pool, but there is a wide variety across CARICOM. And
good morning, everyone. Tom Woods. I'm from St. Martin. I'd have to take issue. I think we're the most integrated island in the Caribbean. Something like 20 ethnic groups on a very small island on the Dutch side of 34 square miles. I've just got a comment. Is that within the region, particularly within the Dutch-speaking countries within the region, people moving around is a very custom thing. Mobile, people move from island to island for work. And that was the customary thing right up till about the 1970s. And when borders came into being, issues actually arose. I just want to make one particular issue is St. Martin appears to be a very attractive country for people coming to work. They see opportunities. And of course we have a very strong remittance trade outwards, about $54 million US. It has created a lot of local issues in terms of migrants moving in and out of borders just within the region itself. And I feel this is becoming quite a big issue for St. Martin and no doubt for other islands as well. And I just want to get your comment on this because stricter border controls, security controls are actually creating a kind of an internal domestic trade within the region. Thank you.
Since there seems to be a little bit of competitiveness about integration, in Geneva we have 42% of the population is not Swiss, and they're from all over the world. But anyhow, leaving this aside, at the moment there is a negotiation at the UN, which I think could be a golden opportunity for CARICOM to come together and negotiate the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. This is right now happening and supposed to be ending in 2018. So it's a short period of time to have a CARICOM position on migration and then also to make this be in part of the global compact that is being negotiated.
I totally agree that these borders are making us a little bit more divisive. I've spoken to people who talk about prior to the 1980s or 1970s when we have Jolly Rogers and people could just move around and how easier it was. But now it seems as if we are a little bit more closed, and that's not positive. So St. Martin might be a good case study for us. And I thank you for your comment about the Global Compact on Migration. I really think it's important for us to position ourselves in this global dialogue because our experiences are important for other people in the world, and they can learn from us and we can learn from them as well. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause. And we hit SDG 17, and we're going to discuss trade now in the context of the SDGs.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Before I start, let me apologize for my voice because I have the flu, but I'll try. And also, I have to give my comments to some of the previous presentations. Let's backtrack. This is 2017. But prior to 2017, 2006, we launched the CARICOM Single Market and Economy. And the CARICOM Single Market was to be the vehicle to achieve everything we're talking about. We were ambitious then. We continue to be over-ambitious now in 2017. We need to backtrack. We need to go back to where we originally started in 2006, where we spoke about the issues of competitiveness. To be competitive, that is how we work in the CSME. First of all, for those of you who don't know, the CARICOM Single Market and Economy is a government-created infrastructure, but it is private sector driven. And the only way private sector in this region can drive the CSME is if they're competitive. And that is something we as a region we have struggled with continuously from 2006 to now. So we cannot expect to achieve goal 17, target 11 if we have not been competitive from 2006 amongst ourselves. It's impossible. And I urge all of us in this room, especially CARICOM officials, don't lose hope. Continue to push this region to remind them of what we agreed to in 2006, actually right here on this campus, January 30th, where we launched the single market to push this region to drive growth, to achieve development. It was to be done with the CARICOM private sector. All right, with that said, let's start. Sorry? Okay, no problem. This is very abstract. Essentially, what I was saying is that goal 17, target 11 speaks to doubling the global share of exports for LDCs in developing countries by 2020. Practically impossible when you have a current export market share of less than 0.001%. It's practically impossible. So I've been arguing, let's go backwards. Let's try to build our capacity, use what we currently have, that is the CARICOM Single Market, and the plethora of existing current CARICOM regional trade agreements. We have trade agreements with Cuba, Colombia, Venezuela, a whole host of Latin American countries that have not yet been maximized because you know what? We have not built the capacity of our private sector. All right, so overall, the Barbadian private sector, this is part of an overall large research. Barbadian private sector is just one case study that I just pulled out very quickly because we've actually, the University of the West Indies Capefield campus, which I'm a member of, we launched an MOU with the Barbados Chamber of Commerce. So this paper is kind of like to kill two birds with one stone, to present here and as well as to present to the chamber. So the brief overview of the Barbadian private sector, trade per capita is currently for the period 2013-2015, US 8,115 per person. Ranking in global trade, we're number 163 in merchandise exports and currently number 117 in commercial services. The Barbadian private sector, main exports, alcohol of less than 80% volume, margarine, bread, pastry, fruit juices, sugar. Non-agricultural exports, we've been pushing petroleum oils other than crude, medicaments. For our services, we've been very good in exporting good-related services, financial, insurance, travel, and transport services. But the new the new executive director of the chamber reminded us Barbados' trade performance is relative to the overall negative economic outlook for the country. The value of Barbados' exports is below par, and the range of products being exported is at best limited. The performance is also reflected in the country's declining market share in the CSME in terms of trade in goods and services. So what are some of these challenges that gives the executive directors of the dismal outlook? First of all, the discontinuation of traditional preferences for agricultural commodities, lagging export of goods and services, outdated equipment, challenges in supply capacity, limited economies of scale, lack of market knowledge, lack of affordable finance. This can be said for every private sector across this region, just not Barbados. So when I saw goal 17, target 11, I thought, wow, we're going to be over-ambitious again. But I believe in trying to attempt to make it work. So reminding all of you again, especially this region, of where we are. We are currently located in this lovely space called Latin America and the Caribbean. Let us look towards our Latin American counterparts. The Panamas, the Costa Ricas, the Mexicos, the Brazils. Let us look to them to boost our trade and our capacity. So, what we like to call the Rampa Center for International Trade Policy, Law and Services, we need to revise our CARICOM forward trade agenda. I was very pleased to hear of the MAPS presentation. Now, in 2013, myself and a member of the Barbados Prime Minister's office, we created a paper where we looked at kind of mapping the Barbados Vision 2025 to the CARICOM single market and economy single development vision, as to how can we align the two to achieve both of them. And we did it in 2013, and I'm reminding all of us that we can do it for all of our Caribbean countries, not only to the SDGs, but more importantly, to the CARICOM Single Development Vision, created in 2006-2007 from deceased Professor Norman Gervin and several other UE academics. So if you look closely at the Barbados Strategy Map and the results for countries, there's a steady rate of export and economic growth to be achieved by 2025 for Barbados. We can tag on this and achieve the 2020 plan, as well as achieving movement within the single market. And the single market I'm talking about, for those of you who are unsure within the region, it speaks to the movement factors of production. These factors of production, first of all, goods being allowed to move with no tariffs or restriction. Services, removal of discrimination on the grounds of nationality for providing a service. So myself as a Barbadian lecturer should be able to come and work in the Jamaican market as a consultant without any hassle whatsoever by any immigration or customs officer, and the same in return. Also, the easy transfer of funds to and from member states, which is practically impossible for, again, a Barbadian moving in the region, as well as not having work permits or any other form of restriction for persons moving as labor within this region. So recommendations very briefly. Excuse me, sorry. First of all, build the capacity of the private sector to diversify their product offerings and identify niche sectors. We don't all need to be producing the same seasonings. We can diversify it. We can offer organic seasonings, for instance. We can think outside of the box to attract different markets. Maximize on existing trade agreements. We have too many trade agreements not to be having a significant amount of exports across our region. So from the single market and economy, the EPA, the CARICOM-Cuba agreement, that would be one with the more. I presented a paper in Bahamas earlier this month on the CARICOM-Cuba agreement. And this is where I think we as a Caribbean, we have a very, very good opportunity. We have had relations with Cuba since 1972, when the rest of the world did not have relations with Cuba. No, we should build on this existing relationship and enter into the Cuban markets. However, first, we need to build our capacity. We need to look at SBS. We need to look at relabeling. We need to look at standards. We need to equip ourselves to become competitive first, then to enter into the Cuban market. But this is a fantastic opportunity for us now to seek to build on the CARICOM-Cuba agreement. We need to focus on entering and penetrating. We don't have a problem with market access. We have too many agreements. We have market access. Our problem is market penetration. And you can only penetrate markets with sufficient intelligence and export development. Increase the capacity of business support organizations. In Jamaica, you're a fantastic case. You have the Export Jamaica, you have the PIOJ, you have several BSOs in Jamaica who support private sectors, especially smaller private sector. Barbados needs to learn from that opportunity. Also, create a regional measurement mechanism to assess the effectiveness of BSO. We love to create, but we don't measure. Before there's any progress, you have to see what currently exists, and to do that, you have to measure it. So I'm urging you to seek to create a regional measurement mechanisms. Also, creation of regional networks, again, going back to the CARICOM single market, utilize what currently exists. We spoke about aligning national development plans with the SDGs, strengthen institutional linkages between regional agencies such as CrossQ, which is responsible for standards, and local BSOs to build capacity of those private sectors seeking to enter Caribbean markets. Introduce a regional work program, again, going back to CARICOM. Give CARICOM the work, allow CARICOM to help you as your regional secretariat. You're a member of CARICOM. Ask CARICOM to create a regional work program for you to achieve several of these goals. And more importantly, create public education programs for CARICOM exporters seeking to enter these Latin American markets. I thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is on the private sector's engagement. I've noticed that in the region, the private sector is not very active in development work, particularly in the SDGs. I'm not sure they are involved or they even know how to get involved in the SDGs. What would be your recommendations is getting them involved? Because it's, at the end of the day, it's their bottom line that matters, but nothing else. So how do we make sure that we engage them and we get them to be aware that their bottom line will eventually be positively impacted if they support the SDGs implementation? And my second question is in terms of the CARICOM engagement. That would mean that we would have to build the capacity of CARICOM to support us, because I'm not sure that at this point CARICOM has the capacity to do what you are asking, what you're recommending to do. We'll have to have a good conversation with CARICOM and see how to support them to support us in the first place.
Yes, I noted your presentation. There's one thing I think you have not mentioned, which for someone like me who travel in the Caribbean is one of the most difficult things to travel in the region. And I think that is one of the, to get to any of the countries in the Caribbean, it's easier to go through Miami or New York and end up back down. And I think that is one of the big stumbling blocks in the region. Sorry, I'm Carol Coy from Staten.
Thank you very much, Ian King from UNDP as well. Taking my colleague's comment on stumbling blocks to travel, I want to mention that because if you look in our region, and I'm old enough to have traveled quite a long time in this region, and it's incredibly harder to travel in our region. And even if we look at the various modes of travel, a lot of it within the Eastern Caribbean is subsidized. Yet there is incredible barriers, for example, to marine travel. The other point I want to touch on, you mentioned your pessimism to the particular SDG target based on the size of the cake that we have, but I might make the case to you that because our share is so incrementally small, it is possible to increase it simply even in a contracted environment, simply because it has no major impact on the wider trade anyway. So perhaps that's not necessarily the impediment to expanding trade within the context of the Caribbean. Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning. I think it's still morning. I'm Rika Singh, CARICOM Secretariat. Just to thank you for your I walked in when I was hearing about the Surinamese or the Guyanese who didn't know Suriname was in CARICOM, and I was like, I should turn and walk right back out. But I really appreciate your presentation. I just wanted to respond quickly to the point about the private sector. And I want us to realize that the private sector has been engaged. They have a seat at the table. Now, we shouldn't look at it that the SDGs and the private sector are not aware. I would argue that the private sector has been involved in the sustainable development of this region. And I could point to Barbados, where during the development of the green economy, scope and study for Barbados, it was the private sector who tabled the green economy to be part of the social protocol. So we have best case examples in the region already for involvement of private sector that now has to transcend into the implementation of the SDGs.
Excellent presentation, really, really good. Didn't seem as though you have a problem with your voice. To just echo what was said before, I think the challenge really, because you have sold the idea of going back to CARICOM. That's the message. And the message is where we have started. Why go forward when some of the things we have planned and we have established mechanism and structure and so forth through CARICOM, get back there. I think the challenge has been this whole thing about the freedom of movement, of access throughout the region. It's a big problem, whether in trade or otherwise. And I don't know that has been resolved. And quite frankly, I think there's an issue of trust and confidence in CARICOM in going forward that we have to address. Finally, I just found that in your presentation, I didn't see anything about tourism as a service and a substantial contribution in terms of Barbados. But I saw the other areas. I don't know why. Maybe there's a reason.
Regarding the comment about the involvement of the private sector, Sandals in Barbados has been doing a fantastic job across the entire OECS. I'm not sure if it's work in the in Jamaica specifically, but I know in the OECS they have been doing a lot of fantastic work, as Ms. Singh said, especially about environmental awareness. Regarding building the capacity of the CARICOM Secretariat, now in this region we like to talk of CARICOM as this abstract concept. It is not an abstract concept. CARICOM is a combination of all the individual sovereign member states in this community feeding into one administrative secretariat in Guyana. So if our member states adequately support and equip that administrative secretariat in Guyana, we can get it done. We don't have a problem in the capacity. These are the same member states that the UNDP and all the other UN agencies are supporting. So if you can support your local sovereign independent member state, that member state can then support its secretariat in Guyana. Now, travel, yes, I agree with you. I'm from Barbados. To get here quickly and on time and with less hassle, I came through Miami. And tomorrow I'm doing the same thing. And I'm being honest with you. And that's a very, very big challenge in this region. But I would remind you, the private sector makes it work. Every Thursday, my mine goes from St. Vincent and Grenada land in Barbados, and they're offloaded on Saturday. The money goes back on Monday and the cycle starts again. The private sector makes it work. It is just us with our infrastructure, bureaucracy, and labels. We create impediments. I was in Bahamas earlier this month, and Bahamas is not part of a single market. And to get to Bahamas, when I got to Bahamas, there was a big line of, for those of you who would have known Bahamas, non-belongers. A fellow CARICOM national said, well, I just thought the CARICOM sign dropped down. She went to the Bahamian line. I was very strict with the non-belongers line, the visitors line. But it reminds me of how glaringly different and how hard it is to travel across this region. And that is something, as I keep telling you, is something that has to be private sector driven. But the private sector makes it work. They do. Okay, and then regarding your point about the data, yes, I do agree with you. It is so marginal, it can be easily doubled. But I am not about just achieving a target. I am here for overall development of my region. We need meaningful expansion. And in order to do that, we can only do that by building capacity and teaching our private sector how to be competitive, and how to successfully enter and penetrate markets. And regarding the trust and confidence in CARICOM, that is something that is built from use. The more we use and challenge the system, the more it works, and the more efficiently it does so. And tourism, no, it wasn't intentional. It's actually there in the paper, and it would have been there under travel and other as well. But it's in the paper. Yes, please.
This session was on partnerships for the goals. I think there are sort of 5 elements that cut across all of the presentations. One was analytics and making them stronger. Keep building the analytics. Analytics for trade, analytics for... The other one was measurement, which is kind of linked to it. Recognizing all the opportunities and the expansions that are out there. I think that was again, a common feature. And then lastly, of course, partnership, trust building, working together. So I think we should all go and have a coffee and do some work in terms of the partnership building. That's the purpose of events like this. It presents lots of opportunities for trust and for us to find ways to improve. I would like to thank the presenters, and I'd like to thank all the audience for your active participation. And